Hello and welcome to episode 31 of the Peterpodcast. I'm your host, reporter Taylor Clydesdale, and with me this week is Stephen Wright. Stephen is running for council for Northcrest Ward, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about how we want to see the community grow and planning for the future.
My fear was councils of the past were not thinking beyond the 4-year time frame. And when you're thinking in 4-year increments, then you're not benefiting the community in any way. You have to think long term. Because if our long term thinking was in place, we would have been building roadways not with 2 lanes of corridor for traffic, commuter traffic. We'd have been building our roadway with 3 lanes of traffic so that we can get to emergency places like the hospital in 6 minutes.
And we also talk a little bit about public utilities and plans for expansions in Peterborough. So, hope you enjoy the show.
So Stephen Wright, and I'm running in Northcrest. Now, I've been a resident of Peterborough for the last 15 years, and in that 15 years, I've seen the city grow. And I'm deeply concerned about some of the issues in Peterborough, such as the rising cost of infrastructure, escalating property taxes, and the risk of seniors being taxed out of their home, and the minimal opportunities available for our young people graduating from Trent and Peterborough. So this is my second campaign. I ran in 2014. I registered late in the game and didn't get a chance to talk to as many residents as I could have or would have been able to. So this time we're out there aggressively out on the campaign trail, making sure that we get to as many voters as we can before even the October 10th online voting date and the October 27th general election date.
Yeah, so maybe you can describe some of your experience that would lead you to be a good representative for Northcrest Ward.
Well, one of my keen skills is my ability to listen, and I guess I hear it a lot at the door where residents are saying, well, our councillors simply just don't listen and they don't simply grasp the issue well enough. When it comes to the political aspect of things, I've been involved since I've been 14 years old. I remember delivering flyers for a Ralph Klein campaign when our family lived in Calgary.
Okay.
My course of study in university is political science. And since leaving university while working in IT, I also had the pleasure of working for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, a citizens advocacy group, as well as the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. There was a brief time that I also was a writer for the Center for Policy Alternative. So I come at this opportunity with some experience that is well needed on council, not the legislative aid as well for Ed Mandrake for a very short period of time while he was a member on the Sharon Carstairs. So years of experience and ready to utilize that experience to the benefit of residents in Peterborough.
So maybe you can tell people, why you've decided to make the decision to run for council.
Well, the first time I ran was over the property tax issue. For the years that I've been in Peterborough, I think my cumulative tax increases is about 28% on my property. In that same period of time, the service level simply hasn't changed. I mean, I didn't pay for water back then. None of the residents in Peterborough paid for water back then. So now we pay for the water on our PDI bill. And our garbage is still picked up on the same days, 2 bags still on Thursday. And then when you talk to the residents that says, listen, my street's been on the municipal list for resurfacing for the last 12 years. I'm still paying more in taxes, but yet I can't get the services that I'm looking for. So that motivated me to run the first time. This time around, it was when, with an overwhelming opposition to the sale of PDI. It was like a council thought they know better than the residents and what the residents of Peterborough actually needed. So the overwhelming opposition was a disservice to residents here. Because with over 80% of the population saying it was a bad idea, as a businessman, you recognize that to grow your business base, expand it. If you want to grow your bottom line, expand the business, expand your operation. You don't sell it and then buy the service back. That's not common sense. Mm-hmm. So that was a motivating factor this time to run and says, well, residents do want to have a counselor that represents them and that understands that a counselor is their de facto lobbyist on issues that benefit them at the end of the day.
Okay. Now, we will dive into the PDI issue a little bit later in the podcast, but maybe you can talk about I imagine that property taxes and reducing costs for citizens is something that it's still a motivator for you as well.
Oh, absolutely.
So how do you go about doing that? Do you reduce the cost for residents, or do you make it so the services are more efficient, or, if the taxpayer is going to pay those costs, there's more bang for the taxpayer's buck?
Well, we have to pay for service. Everyone wants good roads to drive on, so we know that there is a cost on that. The property tax issue on both fronts is that we have to also make sure that it's actually fixed, if anything, to the rate of inflation. But when the directive from council is that we'll recommend to staff that there be a 3% property tax increase without any evaluation as to whether or not what we're paying for with those current taxes are efficiently being utilized, then we're doing things a little somewhat backwards. So we have to look at, in the budgetary process, engaging the public so that the public can tell us what services are priority to them. And then looking at our finances and see what we have available to pay for those services. We also have to have a different conversation with the province and the federal government about how municipalities are funded. And I think Peterborough has an opportunity to lead the charge. The same service level that, are offered in Toronto with the tax base that they have versus the service level that we're able to provide here to residents of Peterborough with its current tax bases are not on the same playing field. So we have to look at how smaller municipalities like Peterborough are funded, especially when we're looking at our emergency service, fire, ambulance, and police, compared to how Toronto funds their services.
Mm-hmm. And now, when it comes to how the city is spending its money, when it's always tough conversations that happen around budget time. I've sat in on a couple of those conversations over at City Hall. But how do you go about improving what the city is spending its money on and saying, here's something that the citizens want, here's what we should be investing in, here's something that's lower priority, we'll pay for that another year?
It's always a tough discussion because everything is a priority, and that's the disadvantage there. But the way the city spends money, our budget process has to involve public hearings. And then we have to evaluate what is available to spend money on now, what can be deferred. There are projects, road projects that are been, and I talked to a resident in Udmanston up in my ward, who've been looking at road repairs and seeing those road repairs done in patchwork. And when you take the cumulative cost of those patchwork projects versus, say, completely resurfacing that road, it would have been significantly cheaper to have resurfaced the road instead of trying to address it in piecemeals.
And I know, just in terms of Peterborough roads, a lot of people have a lot of anecdotal stories about Peterborough roads that they're in terms of municipalities, Peterborough has some of the worst roads. I don't know if there's the evidence to support that, but a lot of people do complain about the fact that our roads are pretty patchy.
If you drive over into the Simon subdivision, you'll get some confirmation that we have some pretty bad road.
Go down the washboarding on Charlotte Street.
Exactly. And you look at Lansdowne, George, I may live in the north end of the city, but I live in the city of Peterborough, and to get to my home, and like most residents in Peterborough have to do, those are major thoroughfares to the city. And for the years that I've been here, I we can count on one hand how many times those roadways have been addressed, and those are our main road through the city. I recall, I think it was 2 years ago in our budget, we set aside $2.5 million on a secondary study on the Parkway. And $2.5 million, as important of an issue as it is to get from the north-south in the city from the north end, we have other roads in the city that actually do need to be addressed as priority. We'll get to it, the Parkway specifically. But we look at the traffic study that the proponents of the Parkway put out, and they're somewhat dubious. I've been in Peterborough 15 years. The population on our billboard coming into the city was that we were at 76,000 residents. We're now at 88, and that's 15 years later.
And in 15 years, we're going to be the increase is going to be a lot more than that increase was 15 years ago.
Exactly. So the north-south corridor, we need a plan B. The building through Jackson Park, building over Jackson Park, we need to be wise about development and protecting the green space. That's a given. So, in the interim, we have to look at how we expand existing roadways. The traffic signals on the existing roadway. We have a subdivision going in on the Lily Lake Highway, but there is no infrastructure that's been addressed. But here's a subdivision being built. And then if you take, an average 3 to 4 cars per driveway, one would have to shake their head and says, well, what was the thinking at City Hall on this particular development without addressing the infrastructure first?
I was just out on lunch a few minutes ago, and Lansdowne Street right now is part of it's cut off because they're doing some construction,
Yeah.
and so there's a lot of traffic that's going through St. Mary Street, which normally when I go through there to grab lunch takes about a few seconds, but it was bumper to bumper from one street corner to the other street corner, and I think that's the fear that's what's going to happen to the Lily Lake Road subdivision, or if they build the subdivision up by the lift locks, that the infrastructure just isn't there to support it.
And what we take from the developers on development charges, I mean, when you look at it compared to other municipalities across the province, it is low in Peterborough. And I've had the opportunity to talk to some of the developers and says, well, how would your feeling be if those development charges had to be increased? And, there are some that recognize it's a soft cost for them because that development charge and it's tacked onto the selling price of a property anyway. It increases pricing in Peterborough somewhat, but then there's that extra money that's needed to address roadways and infrastructure ahead of those developments.
Can you afford to increase development charges, which would increase the price of homes when the price of homes already is very high?
When we take it in comparison to, say, our neighboring municipality, Clarington, Bowmanville, Newcastle, or even Oshawa, Peterborough still does have lower home prices. With the 407 coming through the top end of Cavan. We see a lot of speculators who are just buying properties in Peterborough and converting them into rental units. And that in a sense does drive up the prices as well. The development charges, I don't believe, would raise the price of a home that high that it is out of the reach of affordability for those who are buying homes right now.
Okay. Just in regards to road infrastructure, it's kind of hard to say whether or not, renovating a street, expanding it, widening it, extending it is more expensive than building a new street. And we will kind of get to that conversation when it comes to the Parkway a little bit later. But certainly when it comes to building that infrastructure or expanding the infrastructure that we already have, it's a hard conversation. And again, it goes back into those budget conversations.
It is a tough conversation, but I mean, I look at the example that set out with Ajax. I mean, along Highway 2, you're seeing 3 lanes of traffic in both directions, with one lane of traffic dedicated for transit and emergency vehicle, and aside to it, a bike lane. Now, the city has no much more money than Peterborough does. But, in budgetary years, you make it a priority. And this is one of those things that if we're going to use the traffic study for the Parkway and say, well, this is the projected growth for Peterborough, then each budgetary year, we have to look at those major thoroughfares to the city like Lansdowne, George, Water Street, and say, if we have to expand now, then we need to do a kilometer this year. We're going to do another kilometer next year. It's going to get progressively done as we develop.
So just in regards to the types of roads that we're building as well, I know the city is looking at its cycling infrastructure, its cycling network, and trying to expand it across the city. If you look at George Street right now, there is there's new bike lanes going on George and Water right now. So there is an effort as well to take cars off the road and make it so that if people are commuting to work, they're commuting to work via bicycles or walking, and that feeds into the traffic conversation as well.
The challenge there is where are these people commuting to work? I mean, there are not a lot of job opportunities in Peterborough, and it's one of those things that I think is a significant concern here because economic development is very important. Our industrial park, I was somewhat surprised that you cannot take the bus to the industrial park. And if you're living in the north end of the city, I mean, in the winter months, it's quite unlikely that you're going to ride your bike over to the industrial park for whatever employment opportunities are available over there. We can't look at road infrastructure and the need for those bike lanes as afterthoughts. As we're developing, they should be a component of every subdivision and every development plan, connecting to existing trail systems. So Again, if we look back at the traffic study reports on population growth, to narrow lanes on George Street for bike lanes somewhat seems to be a ridiculous afterthought, because now, if your major thoroughfare and your city is growing, you then bottleneck traffic coming along your downtown. So it wasn't the most efficient plan to say, well, we'll put those bike lanes on the roadways that already exist, that are already narrow enough, and narrow them down to one lane.
I want to go back to a comment that you just said, and that's about job opportunities in Peterborough, and that right now there's not a whole lot of job opportunities in Peterborough. Maybe you can elaborate on that comment.
Well, we should, as a city, entrench our partnership with Trent and Fleming. We've got some very intelligent and very bright young people graduating from those courses. And I've been in Peterborough, like I said, for 15 years now. And in the 15 years that I've been in Peterborough, I have never heard of a delegation from our council, from the business group in Peterborough, that says our bags are packed and we're on a trade mission with the Prime Minister or with the Premier to make sure we're signing opportunities here for the type of employment that our graduates are looking for. It has to be the next 4 years. We look at spending, we have to now look at the revenue side of the books and then where we get those new tax dollars. It means keeping our young people here, making sure they're able to buy homes here, because you can't really do that with a minimum wage job at $14 an hour.
So what types of employers do you propose, we have here in Peterborough to retain those university jobs then? University and college, sorry, I didn't mean to exclude Fleming there.
Yeah, but... Well, I look at the forensic science at Trent, and it's one of those programs I talk about a lot at the doors with residents, because it was only a few weeks ago the RCMP made the statement that, that evidence for their crime lab is not being evaluated fast enough for criminal trials, and as a result, those trials are being bumped. The first thing that council should have done is contacted our local MP, the Prime Minister's office, and our Justice Ministers. Listen, we've got an immense program here with some very bright young people graduating from this forensic science program. Why don't we try and locate a secondary RCMP crime lab here in Peterborough? And again, on those international trade missions, knowing what the courses that are being taught at Trent and Fleming is going out and finding those type of employers to locate in the region.
Okay. I think we're going to take a short break there. We're going to come back in just a couple of minutes.
Okay.
And we'll refresh on water and start digging into issues like the Parkway and PDI.
Oh, looking forward to that.
Awesome. See you soon. All right, we are back here on the Peter Podcast, and we're going to be talking about a couple issues that people care about. And one of those issues is the Parkway, which we alluded to a little bit earlier. And the Peterborough's proposed north-south corridor, been on the books for 70 years. Could be on the books for 70 more, who knows? Right now, we're kind of at a stalemate on that one, because there are those traffic studies that are out at the moment to see what the future of that plan is. But what are your thoughts on the Parkway?
Well, in the last campaign, I made it known that I was not a supporter of the current Parkway plan. And, I've said to those that I talk to about the Parkway that it's, the term alone, it gets residents stuck because they think of this straight corridor that was built through Jackson Park, over Jackson Park, the bridge. The issue really is traffic flow. That's what we have to address here. Any city that has the infrastructure like Jackson Park wants to keep it. You look at Brampton, and Brampton spent $25 million on Chinguacousy Park. We don't build roadways through our parkway. We got to protect that green space, but we still need to flow traffic.
So how do you improve traffic without the Parkway then?
See, we can't look at the Parkway issues with blinders on. We're looking at it currently and saying this is the current borders of Peterborough. Even though we're going through that official plan review, the way to look at it right now is with the what-if scenario. What if the current borders of Peterborough were to shift? Where would our north-south corridor have to be because of where new developments are going to happen?
Okay.
So, as it stands currently, and I've talked to a lot of residents in Northcrest, and says, to get across where Chemong should be our industrial and retail zone, we have to start looking at that, widening it with 3 lanes. 3 lanes going up Chemong, 3 lanes coming down, so that we are now putting in that dedicated emergency vehicle lane. We're putting in a dedicated bus lane and then having that bike lane, so we're not taking away the commuter traffic lanes, so we still have two on each side. Where I am in the Heritage Park subdivision, we have to look at Carnegie and see the road allowance that's available on the center line of Smith. And, look at widening the center line of Smith to move some of that traffic over to the 19th line and straight across to Shamong Road.
Okay. You had said, and I want to pick apart the specific wording of what you had said. You said you're not a supporter of the current Parkway plan. Mm-hmm. Is there a form of the Parkway that you would be supportive of?
The current plan, I think we have to go to Plan B. The current plan, in every component of it, that entails a park. It just cannot be supported.
Okay.
We have fixed infrastructure. We got properties there. I mean, we have to figure Plan B, and Plan B is going to be in phases of getting traffic around the city. A quasi ring road might have to be a part of that solution as well.
And a couple of other council candidates, including mayoral candidate Diane Therrien, has mentioned a ring road before as something that the city should be investing in. The question is that going to help with the internal traffic that's happening inside the city? Or is it just going to make for a longer commute for people going around?
It wouldn't make for a longer commute going around the city, depending where you are. And then if you look at the center line of Smith as one solution and coming into the city, right now, for me, when I travel in up to Television Road and University Boulevard. Coming into the city on a ring road that would have taken me to the top end of Shamong and then down to the 19th line and then down back to the center line of Smith is also a shorter route and going all the way to Television Road. And, if we're looking at the prospect of a ring road now, that ring road might become a component of the city. Mm-hmm. It may not be on the exterior of the city in 5-10 years from now, because we have to think the last conservative government that we had at Queen's Park, amalgamated a lot of cities. We went from over 800 municipalities down to 435. I mean, we can't look at this issue, like I said, with blinders on. We have to look at it. What if the current borders changes? Then our traffic flow issue isn't the current problem. It becomes a new problem. And we have to always be thinking about these issues at least 7 generations ahead.
And, we do have... we did have plans to expand the city's boundaries with the deal with Cavan to... create, I think it was 4,000 acres of industrial commercial land. So that would have expanded the southwest portion of the city. It's not outside the realm of possibility that, the city's borders are
and I'm sure the close conversations are happening at Queen's Park, because when the province has to look at its transfer payment back to the municipalities to pay for services that it covers, I mean, it is just, and I mean, Premier Ford made it clear on his first day in office that the mandate is to cut the cost of government. But who would have thought he meant municipal governments? By slashing Toronto City Council in half, we can't sit back here in Peterborough with sitting on our hands and saying, well, he's not looking at us for any changes at all. They're looking right across the province. How do you cut the costs? And the issue of the airport is an issue that needs to get resolved. That with land in Monaghan, that corridor has to be addressed. Is an issue with Ennismore. So I can honestly say that that conversation is probably happening already at Queen's Park.
Okay. You mentioned something, and it's kind of an aside, but planning for 7 generations ahead. Mm-hmm. That's something that I've heard from our local Indigenous leaders as well.
It's brilliant thinking. I was at the Peterborough Health meeting, and I heard the phrase, and I think, that's exactly what we're supposed to be doing. And it goes right back to that Parkway issue. Had the Parkway been built in 1960, and I would say as far as 1990, it wouldn't be the discussion that we're having today. My fear was councils of the past were not thinking beyond the 4-year time frame. And when you're thinking in 4-year increments, then you're not benefiting the community in any way. You have to think long term. Because if our long-term thinking was in place, we would have been building roadways not with 2 lanes of corridor for traffic, commuter traffic. We'd have been building our roadway with 3 lanes of traffic so that we can get to emergency places like the hospital in 6 minutes. You look at Ajax with the traffic circles, and again, the Highway 2 expansions and how they're doing. They're thinking down the road. There's road allowances set aside for when that city grows to put in a 3rd commuter lane for traffic. And that's just thinking ahead.
Okay. We're going to move on from the Parkway debate. We could keep talking about it for a half hour, but we do have some other things that I'm sure people care about. And you had talked about the PDI sale earlier, and you had said that the support for the PDI sale was not there in the community, so the city shouldn't have gone for it.
No. And, part of my deputation that I made with council was that, and I had conversations with other councillors, and one of the comments that came back was, well, if we don't do it, the province is going to force us to do it. And then I said, well, you have to look at the facts here. Kathleen Wynn's polling numbers were so low, so if the fear was that the province was going to force us into that situation, then we have to look at what will happen in the provincial election that we weren't that far away from. With the overwhelming opposition to it, I was, some taken aback when my two councillors decided that they should vote against public hearings. The public needed to be fully engaged on the issue because there are now questions out of the sale that are still not answered. The deal that died on the table back in October apparently is not the same deal that I've heard the mayor talk about. So what are the changes to the deal from October that made this deal the good deal? There's questions around, am I going to see a bill from Hydro One and a separate bill from Peterborough Utility for my water? There are questions that should be answered, and the public had the right to make sure that those questions were answered. At best, it should have been left as a plebiscite to be addressed during this election to get the public fully engaged on that issue.
Okay.
I think council made a mistake.
No, there is an interesting question that has been raised, a couple of times here and there since council made that 6-5 decision to sell PDI, and that's, is it a councillor's job to, if they truly believe that something is right for the community and it will better the community, making a decision that maybe the majority of the community is against it, but the math makes sense. And I've talked to a couple of councillors who did make that decision, who voted to sell PDI, and they've argued that the value of PDI was going down. The province was seeking to amalgamate a whole bunch of smaller utilities, and they had this deal there that was going to be offering them more money and more value.
On the night that I made my deputation before council, there was another offer that was put on the table. Council flatly rejected the offer from Viridian. There was no opportunity for staff to review it. So if that was the arguments that were being advanced, and I mean that's felonious, it's misleading in that if the value of PDI was dropping and the province was forcing utilities to amalgamate, then why PDI, a profitable utility, wouldn't amalgamate with yet a smaller utility? In any business model, you want to grow your bottom line, grow the base of the business. You have salespeople out in the sales force. You want to sell more of your product, hire more salespeople.
I believe Mayor Bennett at the time did say, and I believe this was him, had said that the issue with the Viridian merger between them and PDI would have been that, there's considerable distance between those two locations, and they would have had to have crossed Hydro One territory to do it.
We don't know the details of that because it wasn't even given an opportunity to be fully explored. So, that his position on that issue, I think there was more that we could have learned, and we should have actually put the sale of the to Hydro One aside and actually look at that and then present both options to taxpayers.
So right now, the deal has been signed, an agreement has been made. I don't think there's anything that the city can do to back out of the agreement now, but with that said, it's worth having the conversation because at some point, the city might look at another one of its utilities or another part of our utility and say, maybe it's worth doing that as well.
Well, it hasn't fully been ratified because it still has to be approved by the Utilities Commission. And, my fear is that if it does get approved by the Utilities Commission, that the next step for Hydro One is to go back to the Utilities Commission and says, although we signed a deal with a rate freeze, I can almost hear the arguments being made. We bought PDI, we bought the distribution arm of it, the infrastructure wasn't as we thought it would be, and in order to maintain it, in order to keep rates low over a long period of time, we now need a 25% rate increase to make sure that we can stabilize what we charge.
Do you think that the Ontario Energy Board would approve something like that after an agreement has been signed?
I don't put a great deal of confidence in the Energy Board that they represent the interests of the residents of Peterborough.
Okay. Now there is I did talk with the Ontario Energy Board about the process that's going to go into the approval of, the potential approval, of the agreement. And They did mention that public input is going to be a part of it, that people can submit letters of comment, or if they can prove that they are affected in some way by the deal, they can be public speakers on that process. So I am interested in how much public input is going to be a part of the OEB approval process for the deal. So we will see how much.
I'm hopeful there's a tremendous input from the public on that, because the deal, without the details of the current deal that council approved, the public has a right to know. But the transparency in government is so important. I mean, the level of apathy that exists is predominantly because taxpayers are saying, listen, everything's done in secret. You'll post something, we have some very smart people running our city to extent, but I can tell you there are some smarter people who just live in the city. They're not sitting on boards, they're not sitting on commission, but when they're providing you feedback, it does make sense to listen. And we're hoping that there are several contingencies that will present before the utilities board to oppose this deal.
And sometimes it is a relatively small number of vocal citizens who speak out and end those things. The reason why we don't have a parkway approval right now is because of 88 citizens who filed letters to the MOE.
And it's again, if we're thinking 7 generations ahead, but you've got to be grateful for those individuals who pose governments on ideas. I mean, there's reasons why organizations like the Federation of Independent Business exists. Their role is to advise government on policy, on behalf of their members, because you can't expect that every one of the members of the business community to be sitting at local council meetings or federal commissions or hearings. People are busy. Peterborough, for the most part, is a commuter city right now. I get up in the morning and I'm out of the city limits at 5 a.m. most days to earn my living. And by the time you get back, council has already had its meeting, decisions have already been made. So when those individuals can aggressively speak about an issue and represent my side of it, that's to the benefit of everybody in the city.
So, and I know this is very hypothetical, but let's say that you get a city staff report. You decide that, okay, this one decision, option A, seems to be the smart thing to do, logically for the city. And then you go to a public meeting and a whole bunch of people say, no, option A isn't what we want. Option B is what we want. That's what we think is smarter for the people of Peterborough. And again, because this is hypothetical, there's a lot of things that you could substitute. PDI issue, the parkway, bike lanes on Charlotte Street. What do you do if you're in that position?
Ultimately, we are the stewards of the taxpayers' money when you sit on council. And ultimately, the positions you take on issue are those that should be representative of the residents of Peterborough, because they are paying the bills. And ultimately, I believe myself to be a smart individual, and I can look at an issue, but there are people out there that are smarter than I, and if you can present to me, minus the emotion, why I'm wrong on an issue, I'm independent enough in my thinking that if I'm wrong, I have no qualms about saying, all right, well, you were right on this one, and this is where the vote has to go.
Okay. Now we're just running out of time, so we only have time to talk about one more topic. We've kind of touched on housing a little bit earlier, but maybe we can talk about, what are your solutions for dealing with the housing shortage that we're dealing with in Peterborough?
I attended a meeting with Peterborough Co-Housing, and it was an eye-opening meeting, because it wasn't something that I had any knowledge about, or because we think just residential housing. And I've talked to some developers also about secondary suites. The challenge for purchasing homes right now for most is the new mortgage rules. I know it's a federal issue, but those changes in banking and to kind of quell the foreign buyer issue has created some problems for individuals who are on the cusp. I know our young people will never, I shouldn't say never, but find it more challenging.
If you want to speak to a young person who's just entering the housing market, I'll never own a home.
I know for my kids, and I have 6 of them, and I know for none of them that they will be in a position to actually buy. It is a challenge. I mean, it's even difficult to pay rent, and we're looking at minimum wages of $14 an hour, and that is a challenge for them. We know housing is an issue, and the affordability of housing is an issue. There are groups I've had the time and the opportunity to sit and talk to who've come up with some really great ideas, tiny home projects, co-housing, for ownership of property. And the co-housing user reading some bylaw changes that are going to have to happen. Lot size, parking. We know that there's some bylaws, but no opportunity. And again, the type of developers that are developing, what their priorities are. Is it profit, or is it making sure that you're building efficient homes that can be purchased?
So you had mentioned, there are options out there for kind of collaborative approaches to housing, like tiny homes and co-housing. What about improving the affordability of housing? What if you're a renter or a homeowner who just can't afford the $800 to $1,000 to $1,200 a month to afford what you live in now?
We see it because there are homeowners in the city that have to rent out a portion of their homes in order for them to afford the mortgage. Those things, we support. Owner-occupied rental units are not a bad idea because we Trent, Fleming, great economic drivers. We need those students here, and those are typically who have to rent those units per room for the $500 a month because that's what they can afford. Creating the bylaw that protects the other type of homeowners is also essential. Property maintenance and making sure those standards are enforced.
Okay. We're just about to run out of time here, so I'll just leave it with you. Is there anything else that you would like to add? Anything that we forgot to mention?
Well, we covered a great deal. So I just want voters that don't there that, October 10th online voting, on my website, electstephenwright.ca, or link to the city site to make sure your name is on the voter list. I've knocked on a lot of doors, and I might be at your door soon. So, we want to make sure that you get out there and vote. This one, like every election, is important. If you want to be heard, if you want to be represented, then I'm asking you to give me your votes as well.
All right. Stephen, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And to everybody else, we'll see you again soon.
Okay.